The Pacific sky was a hard, merciless blue that morning, the kind of light that flattened distance and erased the horizon. From 30,000 feet, the ocean below looked still, but every pilot in those formations knew that beneath that quiet lay death. It was 1,942, and the Japanese Zero ruled the air. Allied crews called it the ghost plane light, graceful, and always turning tighter than physics seemed to allow. Dogfights became duels of patience and precision, and for months, the Zero won almost every one. In those early battles, the Americans, Australians, and British alike discovered a truth that chilled them. Skill alone could not match design. The Zero's long wings and featherweight frame let it pivot like a leaf in wind, while the heavier Allied fighters, Wildcats, P-42s, Hurricanes labored through wide, sluggish arcs. A Zero on your tail was a death sentence. You could dive, climb, roll, or pray, but you could not outturn it. Reports filled the dispatch tables. Enemy aircraft turning inside all maneuvers. Suggest new tactics immediately. Somewhere over the Solomon Islands, a pilot named Harold Coleman decided that new tactics would have to mean something truly new. He was a quiet man, 24 years old, raised on barnstorming air shows and open cockpit biplanes. During one engagement, after his wingman was shredded by a burst of 7.7 millimeters fire, Coleman found himself inverted in a desperate half-roll belly to the sun, canopy to the sea. For a heartbeat, the world flipped, and through the confusion, he saw the Zero beneath him, still banking hard, unaware. Instinct forced his thumb to the trigger. The tracers fell like a silver rain, and the Japanese fighter exploded into a bright, silent flower of fire. Coleman pulled level again, breath ragged, heart hammering. He hadn't meant to do it. The move was an accident. But when he landed, the mechanics who counted bullet holes found something stranger than luck. Every hit had come from above, through the Zero's weakest armor. The thought stayed with him all night that perhaps the impossible could be turned upside down. Word spread through the squadron mess tents. Pilots talked quietly over tin plates, tracing with their fingers how an inverted approach might slip beneath the Zero's vision and strike from its blind side. No manuals described such a thing. No instructor had ever recommended flying a combat pass upside down. But the Pacific Air War was rewriting every rule at once. The following week, a few of the boldest men decided to test it deliberately. At dawn, under the thin clouds of Espiritu Santo, 3 Wildcats climbed into formation. The plan was simple enough. Fly level, roll inverted above the expected Zero patrol line, and dive through from an angle the enemy would never anticipate. It was absurd, even suicidal, but so was staying alive the old way. The ocean flashed silver beneath them as they rolled, canopy down, the horizon now reversed. In the gun camera footage recovered later, the world appears unreal. Clouds below, sea above. A pilot's gloved hands steady on the stick as his aircraft slices through the air, upside down. The Zeros came exactly on schedule, 4 of them sweeping wide from the east. The lead pilot never saw what hit him. The inverted Wildcats dropped out of the sun, firing in short, disciplined bursts. 2 Zeros fell within seconds. A third tried to climb, but overshot, unable to adjust to the strange attack vector. When the surviving Japanese pilot finally escaped into cloud, he radioed a single phrase back to base: enemy, approaching from impossible direction. They kept flying it because it worked. News of Coleman's accidental success slipped through the squadron like a secret code shared in hushed tones between pre-flight checks, sketched on the backs of maps, tested in the spare hours between missions. What began as a single desperate improvisation became, in days, a dozen deliberate experiments. Pilots learned to judge the world upside down. Cloud formations became landmarks beneath them. The sun, a blinding compass overhead, and the sea, a pale, distant ceiling. The first attempts were clumsy fighters who found themselves out of position, guns jammed when held in an unfamiliar attitude, nausea and vertigo knocking men off their game. A few did not come back at all. Instructors cursed and scolded. Squadron commanders bit their lips and turned a blind eye, because results mattered more than etiquette. The upside-down pass exploited vulnerabilities the Zero had never been designed to face. Its light construction gave it extraordinary turning ability at low speeds. But that same design demanded certain compromises. Armor was thin overhead, and the cockpit's view downward, so often used by Allied pilots to gauge a retrace, became a liability when an attacker came from above, inverted. The Zero's pilot, trained to expect enemies at the same attitude as himself, could be momentarily disoriented by a fighter bleeding through from the sun. Hit zones that would have been shielded during a conventional pursuit were suddenly exposed to a rain of bullets. Tactically, it was elegant in its simplicity. A pilot climbing above an expected patrol route could roll inverted and, in a single maneuver, convert altitude into an attack vector that passed beneath the enemy's defensive arc. The attacker maintained energy, speed, and momentum without being drawn into the tight, slow turning circle where the Zero excelled. Flying upside down to ambush was less about daring theatrics than it was about rethinking geometry. Instead of letting the Zero choose the plane of engagement, Allied pilots forced the battle into a third dimension the Japanese doctrine had not prioritized. Word of success spread among the carrier air groups and island squadrons. At first, the technique traveled informally, pilots trading notes in the mess, a wingman repeating the role he had seen in gun camera footage. Gradually, commanding officers formalized what had been improvisation. Training flights were scheduled specifically to practice inverted approaches. Pilots learned to control the aircraft with inverted reference points. The altimeter read the same, but the horizon shifted into a confusing mirror. The artificial horizon became a trusted friend. The outside world, a trickster. Gunnery instructors taught short, disciplined bursts timed to account for inverted ballistics. Mechanics adjusted gun sights and ammunition feeds to behave reliably when gravity pulled differently on linked parts. There were refinements beyond mere rolling the plane over. Pilots discovered that an inverted pass, followed by a quick controlled pull-up, offered two advantages. It allowed the attacker to use gravity to shave ground relative to the target, and it provided an escape route in which energy could be traded for altitude without conceding position. Others adapted the maneuver into a two-plane tactic. One fighter would roll inverted and present a crossfire, while a second, higher element executed a diving run to rake the enemy. Teams learned coordination, radio shorthand, and prearranged angles. The upside-down pass evolved into a suite of ambush methods, rather than a single stunt. The human cost of learning was never absent. Eye problems, blackouts under high-G pullouts, and spatial disorientation were constant threats. Pilots trained their bodies as much as their minds. They practiced orientation drills until the inverted world felt less alien. Medics learned which countermeasures to use for air sickness mid-combat. Experienced pilots mentored rookies on how to breathe, how to time bursts, and how to avoid the small mechanical failures that could doom an inverted attacker, fuel starvation at the wrong moment, a stuck gun breech, a canopy that fogged when upside down. These were details that converted a clever idea into a repeatable tactic. Success bred imitators. Wherever Wildcats, Corsairs, and Hurricanes flew against Zeros, someone tried the inversion. Sometimes the method failed spectacularly. A wingman overshot and became a target. A pilot stalled low and plunged into the sea. But more often, it produced the quiet, bureaucratic victory that wins wars. Incremental rises in survival rates escorted bombers reaching targets with fewer fighters lost, convoys less harried by enemy patrols. Photographs of ruined Zeros and film reel clips of inverted gun camera sequences arrived together at command centers. Analysts measured a small but steady improvement in sortie survival and in pilot kill ratios. For men exhausted by attrition, each percentage point mattered. The Japanese, for their part, adapted as best they could. Intelligence reports noted unusual attack angles, and pilots cautioned one another to expect threats from the sun. Squadron leaders ordered lookouts to practice scanning above as well as around. They trained to break tighter and tighter, trying to negate the upside-down pass by denying the attacker an angle of approach. Yet adaptation takes time, especially when doctrine and machine are married, when the airframe's design and the pilot's training reinforce each other. The Zero superlative turning remained an advantage inside certain envelopes, but the inverted ambush had changed the calculus of those encounters. The bitter truth was that no plane is invulnerable to creative tactics, and no pilot can master every domain. Alongside the flight line experiments, engineers and tacticians began to analyze why the inverted attacks worked so often. Ballistic studies revealed that certain trajectories permitted rounds to strike thinner structural elements. Flight engineers calculated that an inverted dive maintained higher energy upon firing because it allowed gravity to assist in reducing relative airspeed, granting flatter shot geometry. Intelligence officers compiled after-action reports into informal pamphlets, small, soon-to-be canonical guides that summarized do's and don'ts for inverted engagements. These were circulated quietly, away from prying eyes, because tactical advantage had a habit of evaporating once it became widely known. Not all wings accepted the method wholesale. Some commanding officers forbade deliberate inverted passes, fearing the loss of irreplaceable pilots. Others embraced the ingenuity and adapted carriers' fighter training schedules accordingly. The debate was generational as much as doctrinal. Veterans who had learned the old ways had an instinctive conservatism. Younger aviators, those who had survived by improvisation, insisted that survival required constant reinvention. The heady mixture of risk and reward made for a heated but practical conversation, one that the air crews resolved in the field as they always had, by doing. Stories grew into lore. A flight leader who had once been all but certain of his death climbed inverted through a low cloud and downed 2 enemies in a single pass, returning with a grin and a cigarette dangling from his lip. A young pilot who had been mocked for attempting an inverted roll in training later received the Silver Star for an engagement where the maneuver saved a bomber. Such moments were recounted in mess halls for years after the war, carving the upside-down pass into the cultural memory of a generation of flyers. By mid-1943, the inversion had become a recognized tool, one among many in the Allied pilots' repertoire. It did not render the Zero useless. It only complicated the range of choices a combatant had to make. The nature of aerial combat is to create options and force the enemy to choose poorly. The inverted pass supplied a new option. It forced Japanese pilots to split their attention and to anticipate threats from unexpected quadrants. In the larger scale of the Pacific Air War, the statistical edge this tactic afforded contributed, quietly and cumulatively, to a shift in air superiority. And yet the inversion did something else that mattered almost as much. It changed the psychology of a fight. To be the pilot who can choose the terms of engagement to force an enemy into a defensive posture, to surprise from a direction considered improbable, was to seize initiative. That psychological edge often proved decisive. A pilot who expected attack from a predictable plane of movement would tighten, hesitate, and make mistakes when confronted by a new vector. The inversion created confusion. Confusion breeds errors. Errors produce opportunity. When at last the administrators and strategists codified the maneuver, when manuals contained diagrams and carrier briefings listed inverted passes among approved tactics, the upside-down method had already earned its place. The pilots who had developed and refined it were rarely the ones to write the doctrine. They returned to the sky, to new fights, honing other improvisations as the war continued to teach them that no solution was permanent. But the turn had been made. In a theater defined by steel, fuel, and fate, a small act of bodily inversion, rolling the world over to see from a dangerous new angle, had become a quiet revolution. By the time the Pacific War reached its midpoint, the inverted pass was no longer rumor. It appeared in after-action reports, in the shorthand of squadron diaries, and most tellingly, in the results column of mission logs. Commanders who once dismissed it as barnstorming began to notice that the men who flew upside down came home more often. Formal recognition followed, slow and bureaucratic, as it always does. Instructors at Iwa, Espiritu Santo, and Guadalcanal added short sessions called inversion drills. Pilots learned to roll and hold attitude for 30 seconds, to fire short bursts while inverted, and to recover cleanly without losing altitude. No ceremony accompanied it, only a quiet acknowledgement that imagination had found its way into doctrine. New aircraft helped. The Grumman Hellcat and Vought Corsair brought power and forgiveness. Their engines could pull the heavy G-forces that the inversion demanded. Their wings carried fuel systems that did not starve when the world turned over. A pilot could roll, fire, and climb again without the sputter of empty carburetors that had doomed earlier experiments. The maneuver, once a desperate act, became a controllable option. Squadrons practiced paired inversions, one rolling over the other in a mirrored dive, creating cross angles of fire that shredded tight Japanese turns. Gunnery cameras recorded the results, short, lethal bursts framed by the blur of spinning horizons. The Japanese noticed. Reports from surviving Zero pilots mentioned enemy attacking from sky below. Commanders ordered counter-training. Expand the search arc. Watch for flashes of sunlight where none should be. Expect inversion. But recognition did not equal mastery. The Zero's design still punished any attempt to follow an inverted target. Its fuel flow, its aileron balance, even the pilot's harness made sustained inversion nearly impossible. To chase a rolling Hellcat upside down was to risk a stall, and a stall in a dogfight meant death. The Japanese adapted in other ways, hit-and-run dives, ambush from clouds, but the certainty they once owned in turning combat was gone. For Allied pilots, mastery of inversion changed more than tactics. It changed confidence. They could meet the once invincible Zero on even terms. Interviews recorded after the war reveal a pattern of language. We stopped fearing them when we started thinking differently. The inversion symbolized that difference. It was not just a trick of aerobatics. It was proof that invention could outrun engineering. When the U.S. Navy began preparing carrier groups for the Marianas and Philippine campaigns, instructors emphasized flexibility. Roll, climb, dive, improvise. Never fight the enemy's fight, they said. The upside-down pass became the embodiment of that creed. The maneuver's legacy deepened as newer planes entered service. The F-6F stability inverted allowed longer firing windows. The Corsair's gull wings, though awkward on deck, offered remarkable control in the roll. Combat footage from late 1944 shows formations executing half-loops that end inverted, then descending through clouds in mirror image pairs. From the ground, observers saw only brief flashes, the silver bellies of aircraft inverted against the sun, then the black smoke of a struck Zero spinning down. Analysts studying the films could quantify the improvement. Shorter engagement times, fewer losses, higher kill ratios. But the pilots themselves spoke of something harder to measure, the rhythm of a fight that finally felt winnable. In Tokyo, designers tried to counter with the Shidenkai and A-7M Repu, sturdier fighters meant to meet Allied power. They added armor to the canopy roof, strengthened the engine mounts, improved roll rate. Yet by the time these reached combat, the tide had turned. Allied pilots met them with tactics already evolved beyond the simple inversion. Scissors maneuvers that began inverted, rolling breakaways that blended vertical and horizontal planes into one fluid geometry. The old boundaries between up and down no longer mattered. The air had become a sphere in which any angle was fair game. The mental shift outlasted the war. In peacetime, aerobatic teams adopted inverted flight as a demonstration of precision and composure. Instructors who had fought over the Pacific taught post-war cadets that spatial orientation was a state of mind. Jet pilots inherited the lesson without knowing its origin, the belief that no single attitude defined control. In Korea, Sabre pilots used inverted split-S dives to escape MiGs. In Vietnam, Phantom crews used high-G barrel rolls that momentarily inverted their aircraft to dodge missiles. Every generation of flyers carried, quietly, a trace of the same discovery, a willingness to turn the world over, to survive. Archival film, restored decades later, shows those early innovators climbing from their cockpits after missions. Their faces are drawn, salt crusting their flight suits, eyes red from the strain of inverted vision. They do not look like heroes. They look like men who have found a way to endure. When asked how they devised it, one pilot shrugged. "We ran out of right-side-up ideas." It was the most honest answer in aviation history. The war ended, and the skies over the Pacific softened to peace. The pilots went home, scattered across continents, their stories reduced to brief notes in declassified reports. Yet every modern flight manual that teaches controlled inversion, every aerobatic routine that begins with a slow roll through horizon, carries an invisible lineage to those young men who dared to flip their world when logic said they shouldn't. Innovation, it turns out, needs no committee, only desperation and an open mind. If you stand on an empty airfield at dawn and listen, you might imagine the sound they heard, the faint hum of engines high above, the sudden silence as a plane rolls over into the light. For a moment, the horizon disappears. The sky becomes the sea becomes the sky, and gravity itself seems uncertain. The routers, and the risen, and the disappears. The risen, that are Armia T, and now Problement, towers, and by 10, that sea, that risen, and by problem. In that fragile inversion lies the story of survival, of creativity in the face of fear, and of how a handful of pilots turned defeat into design. The records list numbers, dates, victories, losses. They do not record the thought that passed through Coleman's head the moment he first found himself upside down and saw an enemy beneath him. But the result of that moment rippled through decades. It taught generations of pilots that the limits of flight are as flexible as imagination. It is why, even today, the slow-motion footage of a fighter rolling inverted above cloud still carries a quiet echo of 1942, when the Pacific sky turned over, and with it, the course of the war.